I'm delighted with the panel of very distinguished speakers who have put themselves forward to participate. Probably don't need very many introductions, but from the immediate left, your right, Paul Brockman, who is the Chief Executive Officer of N-Star US, Barry Gale, partner at KPMG, James Mounty, the Willis Reed Global Practice Leader for Customized Solutions, Zolt Salkai, the President of Premier EU, and Sylvain Leroy de Galal, hope I pronounced that properly, the CEO of IRLA. So we've prepped a few questions. I'm going to sit down because it's an hour long, a long hour to stand. And I will first just ask the panel to give just 2 or 3 minutes perspective of what they have seen or taken from what's been happening in the market in the last 12 months. And I'm delighted we obviously have acquirers and advisor and broker, so hopefully a number of different perspectives. So I'm going to start next to me, Sylvain. You want the mic or are you going to shout?
Yes, I'm going to use the mic. So good morning, everyone. So yes, it's been a busy year. I think from our perspective, what we did observe is continuous high volume and higher volume than in the past few years before of deals coming to market. That's clearly the most noticeable trend. I wonder if it's not been higher than the year before. So it's actually quite a good sign from a market perspective. On the other hand, I think there's also a lot of pressure because there's a lot of money in the market, there's a lot of capital. I think we'll come back to that. And despite the fact that there's not many new acquirers, the existing ones have a lot more needs and a lot more capacity. That's putting a lot of pressure on prices.
We'll just move along the table. Susan, please.
Thank you. Well, just to mention some obvious points we are all aware of. So what you've seen the last couple of years, not only the last 12 months, just to mention a few: operating profits under pressure, rate decline continued, investment returns remain low, alternative capital capacity growing and increasing capital requirements and regulatory demands, which also put a lot of pressure on the cost side for any player in the industry. At the same time, we also see that a lot of insurers are investing into new technology, into insurtech business, and I think this has 2 sides for the industry. On the one side, a massive opportunity. On the other side, it's also a trend, and every company has to get engaged in the new developments and defining new target operating models. What we've seen then, what does that mean for the legacy market? From our point of view, is that for most of the companies to get a new target operating model implemented, the starting point is to think about the previous business and selling legacy portfolios, streamlining balance sheets is one of the major starting points on the way to a new target operating model.
From the broker perspective, lots of deals we're seeing, particularly in Lloyd's market, fair bit in the US. There's so much interest with our clients. Not everybody is very familiar with the legacy market. So a lot of the conversations we have are exploring what are options broadly. So thinking about adverse development covers and how to manage reserve-related volatility and optimize reserve-related capital. So we've seen trades that are perfect fit for the legacy market, and we've seen some where the clients would prefer to deal with the reinsurers or aren't quite sure, and then we end up doing a lot of exploration. But yes, I think the main issues are probably handing over the cash for an LPT or a reinsurance to close, and then whether companies are willing to see claims control, and not everybody is. So I think there's a bit of a distinction between kind of fully discontinued lines and then the people that want to optimize on capital. And that, at the end, we're spending a lot of time having those conversations with our clients.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think the market's in a great place, but I do think you can separate demand and supply a wee bit in terms of levels of maturity. I think the demand side, by which I mean the acquirer side, is showing even more signs of maturity from my perspective. You know, there is more capital coming in, but it's better suited capital, I think, than it ever has been. I think most of the acquirers are far more disciplined about the way that they go about things, the way that more discerning around the sorts of business that they go after, you know, understand what works for them better than they ever have done. Whereas I think on the supply side, it's still a little bit less mature. I think a lot of the deals are still a bit more opportunistic in nature. You know, there's a lot of reasons to be hopeful that there will be more and more supply, you know, whether it's Lloyd's or the US or continental Europe, or perhaps the sort of back years of current underwriting. So a lot of reasons to be very, very optimistic around the growth on the supply side, but I still don't think, I think it lags behind the demand side in terms of levels of sophistication. I mean, obviously a couple of notable exceptions in the room, but you know, I think that's, if the same question would have been asked to me a year ago about what I expected to see, I think I'd have expected to see a bit more structure on the supply side by now.
Thanks, Barry. Good morning, everyone. I think following on Barry's comments, I think I largely agree with that. There certainly can be more sophistication on the seller side. The markets across the world, particularly in the US and Europe, are vast. I think it's down to us as an industry to try and unlock some of that potential. If you look at some of the bigger carriers in the market, I think we really are just scratching the surface. It's up to us to make sure that some of those carriers are aware that it really makes sense to divest themselves of what is not core business to them and put it in the hands of companies that really specialise in that business. There's real benefits for policyholders, for regulators, for the industry as a whole. So I think I largely agree with the rest of the comments from the panel as well. One comment I'd make as well is we're seeing a forever changing mix of the lines of business that come to market. If you look at the US 7 or 8 years ago, we saw a lot of direct work comp in the market, and obviously that was at a time when direct work comp, particularly in California, wasn't performing well. Over recent years, carriers have had a much better time of it, the results are much better, so we're not seeing as many of those portfolios come to market. Recently we're seeing more construction defects, auto, labour law, particularly in the US, and that's really following the cycle of lines of business that are under pressure, and we need to make sure that we're in a position that we can respond to that, make sure that we're innovative with the solutions that we provide, and we're able to look at the next thing, some of the key issues in the market that we need to address. That's Paul.
Thank you, panel. There's a number of obviously different perspectives on the market there, and one of the key areas that we've always been looking at, certainly in the PwC survey I mentioned earlier, has looked at the European runoff space for a number of years, and there's always been the perspective that yes, there will start to be an influx and a greater interest of deals in Europe, which doesn't yet seem to have taken place, albeit there are signs of it. But I just want to sort of get views from the panel as to where they see the sort of the main increase in activity, whether that's in the European market, whether it's the USA, or perhaps even the rest of the world. Are there other pockets of territories out there where runoff is beginning to become more of an acceptable part of the cycle to manage in its own particular way, or even to dispose? So, and I should say, please feel free to put up hands and question the panel as we go through the session. This is here for your benefit to try to, you've got 5 great speakers up here to try to get their views on specific items, rather than us just talk and say what we think you want to know. If you do want to know something specific, please ask. And I should just say there are a couple of regulators in the room, we should make that clear, from the FCA. So having said, please feel free to ask a question you probably now won't. So just really where do the panelists see the most activity sort of coming from at the moment between sort of Europe, US, and where the rest of the world is beginning to pick up? I might ask James as sort of the broking base.
So we are seeing all sorts of changes at Lloyd's in particular. So with that decile 10 review last year, just a general expense ratio and all sorts of businesses changing. We're hearing people pulling out corporate capital, and there are opportunities therefore to buy corporate members, to buy syndicates, to do LPTs, and then obviously there's already the reinsurance to close business there as well. And although a lot of the lines that syndicates exited were quite short tail, I think just the trimming and the kind of whole optimising of capital is going to accelerate, particularly where so much money is actually going to be withdrawn from the market over the next period. We also have this decent deal flow in the US, and for Europe, it's just not quite there yet, honestly, which is a surprise to us because interest rates on continental Europe are quite low, and you'd think that people would want to do something else with their money rather than allocate capital to Washington.
Barry, from the advisor perspective, I know you're probably more Europe-centric, but from your colleagues around the globe.
Yeah, I mean, you want a global comment, although you're probably going to get a UK one more than anything. I think because I agree with James that Lloyd's is obviously a place where everyone is focused on. Clearly, it's a different market, both in terms of its characteristics, but in terms of also who can currently compete in that market, given the lack of platform and experience that some of the acquirers will have. But one interesting thing, and again I suspect it will be UK related, but some of the company market, having seen the Lloyd's growth in Lloyd's, they're starting to think again about whether RITC, but in the company market or something similar, whatever you want to call it, can you reinsure out some of the back years of books that you currently underwrite? And the way the Lloyd's model will do that naturally. Is that something that companies should start to look at now? I think we'll see some more growth there actually, where as long as there is a distinction between current underwriting and the history, helped by the increasing sophistication on the buy side, people are much more comfortable in selling now than they ever were. And we'll start to see 15, 14, 13 type years and prior being sold on current underwriting in the company market.
It's an interesting point. I suppose that the issue there with the RITC and Lloyd's is a very well established process that effectively moves those the 3-year-old business from the members that were on that at the time to the members of the current year. Now in the company market, the only way to do it is through a Part 7 transfer process, so it obviously has a distinct difference, whereas Lloyd's you can do it very effectively and quickly, not necessarily easily, but it's a very effective process without having to go through what's potentially an 18-month court and regulatory driven procedure. So I agree that whether that desire to move into the company market to say let's clear out liabilities that are more than 3 years old, but the process to do so will be significantly more cumbersome than
you can just do a reinsurance though, it doesn't have to
do a reinsurance. Obviously that doesn't give the finality, just the economic relief.
Sure, but I think some of the company market will probably take reinsurance as a result.
So I'm just specifically looking at the US, and with the benefit of having Paul here, who is obviously based out in the US and has been working very closely with Oklahoma. Just wondering the extent to which the new Oklahoma legislation, and you might want to briefly touch on that, Paul, as to what it is developing more interest in business transfers. And can everyone still hear at the back, or would you prefer mics? Everyone's nodding away, so. Paul.
Yeah, but thanks, Paul. So I think that in Europe we probably don't think that business transfers, Part 7 type transfers, they're not really a bigger deal in terms of the newness and uniqueness in Europe and the UK, because we've achieved like 280 transactions in the UK. $100 billion of liabilities transferred. In the US, it is a big deal. You obviously have a very different regulatory landscape with 50 different regulators, no real federal system. There aren't any IBTs in place. We've had a number of initiatives around the market. Rhode Island, I think were the trailblazers in that particular area, but no transactions have been done to date. Oklahoma's legislation is very similar to Part 7 legislation, so it covers all lines of business. It has a number of robust regulatory checks and balances. Independent expert works on behalf of the regulator. There is a communications plan that goes out to all the key stakeholders, policy holders, brokers, guarantee funds, the insurers, and then goes forward for court approval. So very similar type of structure to Part 7's. From Penstar's perspective, we've been supportive all the way through of the legislation that was going through. I think that we recognise we've done those sort of transfers in the UK, Europe, Australia. I think there's a real industry need for it in the US, and we've had significant interest from a number of carriers that really want to get economic and legal finality. But it's a real interesting time at the moment because there is divided opinion amongst the regulators. We've spent the last year or so lobbying, having 10, 12 panel discussions, both formally and informally, around the country in the US. What we're seeing is definitely some momentum and some interest with the market, some interest with the regulators. The regulators are split at the moment, but that really is no surprise. You have half of them seem to be interested and in favour. You probably have a quarter of them that just want to wait and see what's going to happen, and then you have a quarter of them that really show quite a lot of resistance. But when you speak to them, they don't really understand the legislation, and some of them can't really articulate why they're opposed to this type of mechanism. And I think that what it comes down to is really making sure that policyholders are protected within their states, which is what we all want. We want a robust procedure to be in place because, as a market, we want to make sure that companies that are potentially affecting these transfers and taking business on can actually service policyholders and do what they need to do. So it's a very interesting environment at the moment. I think that we believe that in the US, particularly on the regulatory side, we don't deal with hypotheticals particularly well. So there are working groups in place that a number of us in the industry have spoken to the NAIC. I think that the best way of moving things forward on the Oklahoma legislation and Rhode Island and any other state that has it is an industry to use that mechanism, use the legislation, and turn this from a hypothetical discussion into transfers have happened, and everything's okay, policyholders are protected, and we can move forward and we can use them as a market. I think that the final thing I'll just say on that is I think sometimes the regulators forget as well that a number of the Part 7 transfers that have happened, particularly in the UK, have affected US policyholders in almost every state without exception, and a number of the regulators have had to approve those transactions where there are trusts involved, etc. So I think it's really a case of continuing as an industry to support initiatives to make sure that we continue trying to work with the regulators, work with each other as an industry, and just make sure these mechanisms are in place, because it is a tool that carriers will want to use in the US. And we say that because we're seeing a lot of interest in that regard.
That's cool. I think one of the messages that I took home from the IRLA Congress we had earlier in the year, where we had Glenn Mulready as the Insurance Commissioner of Oklahoma and Matt Gendron from Rhode Island, was that there's been a lot of lobbying by the buyer community out there, and they want to see more lobbying from the sellers. So the major US insurance carriers and reinsurers, they want to see them approaching the NAIC and their local commissioners to say, we want to have this toolbox, we need to be able to dispose of this business. So I think the message out there is for those that want to dispose of business, to make that quite clear to the regulators that they'd like this IBT process to be implemented. I don't know if anyone else on the panel wants to comment on Oklahoma or even on Rhode Island, which seems to be, I don't know, in some sort of coma for the speed with which they're working. But Oklahoma is certainly going to be perhaps steering the march on them at this rate, but I don't know if you have any perspective on Rhode Island.
Yeah, so if you don't mind, I'll just comment on that, because I think that, I mean, Rhode Island are in a little bit of a tough spot because they just haven't done a transaction. So it's difficult, years down the line. It will be the same for Oklahoma. If the transaction doesn't get done, we're going to be talking about it in 3 or 4 years' time. I think that as an industry, what we really want to see is these mechanisms being put in place in more states and more states. So from our perspective, we're very supportive of the Rhode Island legislation as well. I think that it is a bit more complicated, it is a bit more restrictive, and that's probably why it hasn't been utilised so far. But what we'd like to see is reform across all states. We think that it would be very difficult in the short term to get consensus amongst all of the states. There's a restructuring working group who are trying to put together a model act. We think that can only really happen once some transactions have gone through, and some of the doubters, some of the regulators that really just sitting there can see that these transfers can be effective. They can protect policyholders in their states. So I think we generally have to support the initiatives amongst each state, whether they're division laws, whether they're IBTs, whatever innovative ways they can come up with for dealing with us being able to provide solutions within those states.
Thanks, Paul.
I'm not sure, just one observation on that, looking from the European perspective. In Europe we have a quite efficient way to provide legal transfer by regulatory approval, which compared now to the UK, it takes something like 3 to 4 months, and it's...
No, I just wondered if you wanted.
Even though it's still an interesting market, and it's a difficult one at the same time, because there's a lot of potential. Everybody understands the benefits of doing run-off transactions by way of reinsurance or legal transfer, but this is the market still needs education. So Paul, I'm not sure when you say that the comments from the regulator in the US was that also the sell side has to request that these initiatives are done. I'm not sure that can happen. I think, as you just said, we need to invest more time in supporting the regulators to understand why this should be implemented and how this supports the market actually to function in an efficient way and provide to the companies a way of restructuring balance sheets.
Any comments, observations or questions from the audience before we move on?
Yeah, just to say that in terms of that lobbying process, we know through sort of Sidley that we're acting for a number of carriers in the US who are very much engaged in that lobbying process and are drawing parallels specifically not just with Part 7 but with the European regimes as well. And as has been commented, one of the big focuses of the regulators has been policyholder protection. And some of the questions we were getting are, well, how many examples are there where Part 7s have been just blocked by the court, really listening to policyholder objections? And of course, we've now got the classic example of that in the Prudential case, which actually might be quite helpful in the context of some of this US lobbying, even if it might be less helpful in a UK context.
Yeah. Yes, and if anyone wants information on the Pru case, then I think Jerry's addressing that at the PwC presentation later. Moving on, since we've got quite a lot of questions on different matters, I'll move on to the buyer side now with Sylvain and Zolt. And the question and James alluded to it earlier, sort of continuing depressed interest rates and investment returns. Is this triggering a noticeable uptick in interest from prospective sellers? Don't fight over it, guys.
Yeah.
Fight for the microphone.
So, Well, as I said at the beginning, I mean, this low interest yield environment has been here now for longer than we would have expected. What does that mean for the industry in general? On the one side, and I'd like to take the positive one first probably, we have seen a couple of years where underwriting discipline was going not on the top of the agenda, because everyone was looking on getting more assets into the balance sheet and looking with those assets generating investment income. Now, after a couple of years missing that investment income, I think that could and will lead to more underwriting discipline. At the same time, the low interest yield environment puts also pressure on the pricing in our industry. So I think, as always, this also has two sides and is an advantage and a disadvantage at the same time.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think we should never forget that sellers suffer the same pressure from low interest rates, and that adds, of course, some pressure on their own balance sheet and their own results. So when that happens, which has been the case for a few years now, ultimately you have to do something, and you have to act, and you have to restructure your balance sheet, and looking at your legacy portfolios is one way of offloading some risk and of lowering your capital requirements, obviously. I think just on the level of competition and discipline, this is really something that I think the market needs now to take into account, because, like many of us, I think, I've been working at some stage in my career many years ago now in the live environment, not just in the run-up environment, and it's exactly the same trend. People live with this luxury of having high interest rates, and therefore they really don't care about what they write. I mean, ultimately, I'm being a little direct and cynical, but that's exactly what happens in the market. And I think in run-up we have reached that stage, and we need to be extremely conscious and aware of that, because ultimately, if the run-up market doesn't work, it's the whole industry that is going to suffer. Because I really believe that we buyers of run-up bring the solution to the market. We are actors of this market. This has become the case more and more over time. I think we were initially seen as perhaps not having the best reputation and being the sort of vultures, zooming on the poor praise, but I don't think this is the case anymore. I think we are really part of the toolkit, and we are addressing a stage of portfolios that is, let's say, normal, that happens. Not, of course, every portfolio goes into run-up, but it happens, and it is fully accepted by the market. So if we players are not able to be more disciplined, then I think we're going to commit suicide, really. And that's not good for anyone. And the last thing I want to stress is, if people fool themselves by believing that they can be more aggressive on the investment side by looking at different asset classes, I think they need to understand that they're also adding a lot of volatility, and volatility means risk, and risk should mean more returns. So I don't think there's an easy way out of that. And the very last thing I'd like to say is, a lot of us, and I think we share that, we have investors backing us. We have people who decided to invest in this industry because they believe that it can give good returns. If this is not the case, we will not have investors anymore.
And Paul, any view from the US, where obviously 18 months or so ago it looked as though the rates were on the increase and now they're sort of back on the downward slide. They're obviously not as severe as the euro rates, but is it a driver in the US? Investment returns are different perspectives.
I think it is, but I think it's a combination of ingredients, really. I think that there's no easy money to be made on the life side at the moment. It's hard yards for every carrier, and I think that's a combination of low interest returns, disciplined underwriting, as we just said, and I think a lot of carriers are under a lot more scrutiny and pressure to actually make sure they are writing the right business, they're actually carrying on managing the right business, things that are core to them, are under review almost every single year, and I think that's right. And I think it's up to us to make sure that everyone knows that there's a market out there that can be available if they want to divest themselves of what is not going to be their core business going forward. Allows them to be more capital efficient, puts in the hands of companies that can actually deal with that business, which is better for everyone, but policyholders, better for them. So I think the interest rates are just one part of the component, but they are an important part.
I mean, I think to sort of follow on from Paul's comment, I don't think I've been involved with a deal ever where low interest rates or low investment returns have been the trigger for the deal. But behind the scenes, that is presumably making people look a little bit harder as to what they've got, and all of a sudden then they will identify an issue, maybe with the performance of a given portfolio or the volatility associated with something. So perhaps it's a driver, but I don't think even now it's something which is a trigger for any specific deal.
So sticking with Barry, you and James as sort of representatives of the sellers, there's a lot of commentary about it deemed to be a seller's market currently with pricing pressures. Are you seeing that, and a seller saying to you this is a good time, or are they saying actually it's still a buyer's market? What's the general motivations, and then whether they think you're able to convince them that it's a good time to sell because it is a seller's market?
It is undoubtedly still a seller's market, but I do think it's a different seller's market to what it was 2 years ago. I think 2 years ago, anything that you wanted to bring to market, you would be guaranteed a significant number of buyers that would be feasting over that particular portfolio, and you'd be guaranteed a very strong first and second round, and you'd be confident from the outset, I think, that you would get the right terms and conditions. I think now you need to work a little bit harder because the buyers are that much more disciplined and discerning. I think you need to work a bit harder up front to identify which of the 10, 12, 8, whatever number of sellers there are most likely to be focused on a given portfolio, and work a bit harder with the seller to prep for that group. If you are with advisors that have been around for some time, they'll understand that certain organisations do things differently and want different things. And so I think there is a piece around understanding what the market's going to look like, understanding what that group wants, and probably accepting that those fewer buyers will expect a bit more in return in terms of help to get them over the line. So I'd still say be very confident walking into any sell-side meeting that there is the right market for a given portfolio, but I wouldn't be as confident that everyone will give it a good go in the way that perhaps 2 years ago they would, and so you've got to be a bit more targeted.
James from the broking.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think a couple of years ago we were able to kind of wander around the market, say, it's great deals that we have everywhere, just let's package it up and sell it. And I think we've got 5 deals in the market at the moment, and what we're seeing is just a little bit more discipline, actually. There's not definitely, we're not getting the kind of discounts, or there's not really any discounts anymore on reserves. And actually some of the portfolios that we've ended up bringing into the market haven't flown off the shelves as much as we thought they would. We had one Gen Max in school as well. So I think there is more discipline in the market. But in a way that's kind of a good thing, because we don't really want you guys competing too much with each other. Obviously we want a kind of a sustainable market, and we want that. I think that's quite important to have that kind of level of sustainability across the cycle.
Any perspective from
just one comment on that. When we are looking on a transaction, we are in the middle of the process. I always got the same impression that this is a seller's market, because you get that pressure from the sell side and also from the advisors, obviously, on the pricing. On the other side, I think, and that's probably following up on Barry's point, it's very interesting to see that not only the capacity on the buy side has grown, but also the cake got bigger. So there are more sellers, and also the sellers are competing with each other. And I can say this now from a buyer's perspective, working at the same time what I didn't really see in the last 5 to 10 years, working at the same time, several transactions at the same status. So it's getting harder also on the sell side to get a portfolio or a risk transfer to the right buyer.
Yeah. There's too many transactions in the market at the same time because of the problem.
So does that imply that there's space for more players on the buy side?
No.
There's obviously increased interest we hear from you. Obviously, the private equity and hedge funds and even pension funds, reinsurers. Do the panel think that there will become any more significant buy-side players, or is it a case of the sell side is just too focused on, not too focused, but is equally focused on the reputation of the buyer, and so are less inclined to deal with a new kid on the block?
I think that's a very interesting point, a very good question, because
thank you.
Just because there is more complexity, I was not expecting different. Just because there is more capacity. I mean, additional capacity increases the competition, obviously, amongst the players. But I think, especially in the legacy market, is not just setting up a carrier and just do transactions. You need to deliver. You need to show the track record. You need to deliver. You need to have the reputation. You need to have the operational capability. It's not just providing capacity to take risks, but it's a more complex area of insurance business.
Yeah, I think it takes much more than funding. It takes a whole team and an operational capacity, and that is also something that regulators are looking at. So I agree. I mean, and if it had been easier than that, there would have been many more new entrants in the past few years. And I don't think we've seen many new entrants. We've seen more capacity to the existing players. So that's a good sign.
I won't disagree with you. Wearing the R&Q.
I think when we're looking at it, it's about the reputation of the people in the market, the infrastructure, and obviously price is important, but at the end of the day, you've got to be able to execute the deal. So I think when new entrants are coming into the market, we will talk to them, but when it comes to recommending people what to do, if it's kind of the marginal price, I think we would always recommend more established players.
I think somebody described last week in conversation that capital is a hygiene factor at the moment. It's something that almost anyone can access. I think we are working with a potential new entrant, and they do have on face with a lot of capital to bring to the market, and they did think that they would be able to distinguish themselves from the challenges that others have had around lack of experience and platform in one way or another. But I think they've recognised that it's very, very difficult to do that. And I think one of the really big challenges here, and looking around the room, there is by and large a group of familiar faces, is that if you rewind 10 years ago, there isn't a lot of new talent, not a lot of it, that's in seniorist positions in the market yet. And so if you do want to come in and platform people experience is so important to you, it's hard to look beyond what's already there, and maybe even it's hard to grab from people that are up and coming in certain businesses to then lead a new platform. So I think for me, talent is a real challenge in trying to make that step up as a new entrant, and it is much easier to support existing players, and I think a lot of the capital you're seeing coming from the pension funds and those guys that aren't looking for the same level of return as conventional PE perhaps a few years ago, they're probably finding it easier to back existing players than they are startups.
Any comment for you, because you're poised to
I think that one comment I'd make is that there's been a lot of capital attracted to the run-up sector over the last few years through pension funds, hedge funds, other areas. But I think the reason for that is they look at some of the carriers and they can see that there's double-digit returns that been achieved, and you take a look at the live market, it's a tough area, has been for a while. But the simple fact is, it's not easy to actually achieve that from a standing start. To become a long-term investor in the space where you are consistently going to execute you're going to provide the solution to the seller that they want, that they're going to get rid of their issue, you're going to look after the policyholders, you're going to service that business. And you want those companies to come back to you again and again and again. To achieve that from a standing start is incredibly difficult. I think that anyone that's on the buy side on this panel or in the room will turn around and say it is not easy to achieve these returns. It looks great on paper, but to execute is a very different matter.
Okay, thank you. James, picking up on something you alluded to much earlier, with is there a preference for sellers to transact with traditional reinsurers who are dabbling in the legacy space rather than go to a run-off acquirer who perhaps they're not as familiar with, and what can we as the run-off market then do to address that?
So I think it really depends on the seller and how experienced they are. But we come across lots of people that they've done the old LPT or adverse development cover with the traditional reinsurers, and because they're familiar with them and they think about rating. And we've had some transactions where we kind of run a parallel process where we try and engage with the legacy market and the rated reinsurers, but there's some types of liability that the reinsurers just don't want to write. Some where I think you guys have a more experience. I mean, particularly the EL stuff, asbestos related stuff, where it's impossible to really put that type of risk into the reinsurance market, the rated reinsurance market. So for us, I think we believe actually the legacy market's best placed for almost every deal, really. And it's really the ones that don't fit are where the client isn't exiting the line of business, they want to maintain their claims control, and maybe in certain circumstances the cash flow is an issue where they don't really want to transfer a big chunk of money, particularly in an area where maybe they haven't exited line of business. So that's that kind of motivation where it's capital optimization rather than just lasering out and dealing with a specific segment. So I don't necessarily think. I think for us it's a bit more of an education process we have to go through with some of the buyers, and I think for the legacy market you can do the same thing, but probably you're going to pick up more straightforward traditional transactions, and what gets left in the reinsurers and slightly structured deals or LPTs where it's less permanent, like with a commutation provision of 10 years or something. It's more likely what we're seeing with the kind of Munich and Swiss picking up.
I think I'll just pick up one of the points that Barry made about, well, in essence, us all being old farts in the buying market, and just stress that we have the young professionals group at IRLA, which is 350 strong, really shows that there are a lot of people coming through that are being put forward by their organisation. We have them at R&Q. I know there are from members on the panel here, as well as the selling community, the broking community. So there is a really vibrant, enthusiastic group of under 35 moving through. So the real hope that the attitude to runoff will continue to develop and certainly improve in the market, so it becomes even more embedded as part of the cycle. So I just wanted a little sort of plug for YPG. We've got 10 minutes because we have to be out of here sharp. So questions?
Yes, I'm wondering if any of you that have exposure to U.S. books have seen or foresee any impact on interest in doing deals because of the recent legislation in various states reviving the statute of limitations for sexual molestation claims, which will have obviously an impact on old year and legacy books.
Good question. I think there's a number of buyers who already have that on their books at the moment from significant deals previously, but anyone want to take a stab? I imagine there will be an increased interest in people disposing of books that have abuse exposure, but are we going to see a potential flurry of activity? US players.
I think that the likelihood is yes, because I think that it will probably scare the carriers out there that are kind of sitting with those sort of liabilities on their books, thinking that this, the legal landscape changes so quickly and can adversely affect those claims and those books of business that are affected by those claims. So I think that it will lead to some sellers really wanting to really get rid of those exposures off their books. So the short answer is yes, I think there's some opportunity.
It will, but I'm doubtful that this can happen quickly, because as always, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty until people see, have some clarity on what does that mean quickly and the quantum. So I don't know, but in those circumstances, nobody will rush to either sell and particularly buy.
Other questions at the moment? I'll move on. Now, the next question I had is how are regulators behaving, but I think I'll change that because we have the FCA in the room. But I think it's just a general observation from the panel as to the regulatory perspective, changes that may be taking place in Europe or US and UK, and are the regulators becoming more focused on what's happening in the runoff space? Who'd like to go first? Maybe one of
Probably non-regulated one should start.
one of the advisor or the brokers regulated.
Hardly ever get to talk to regulators. I'm sure I mean, all I see, honestly, is that in Europe, where we see most of that there are some retrospective type reinsurances, again, less permanent type structures, which which could be better structured, probably. But yeah, generally, we don't get to speak to the regulator very much.
I think there's no doubt that scrutiny levels continue to go up from a regulatory perspective. I mean, if we look at business transfers, and particularly those with a UK angle, I mean, there's no doubt that there are increasing hurdles around governance, around capital and its permanency, I guess, around the for a UK deal, the amount that may be reinsured out of the UK once the transfer has been done. Prue and Rosse, I know that's for another day, but that is only going to challenge non-life deals too, albeit potentially can be distinguished on the facts. So I think on any given transfer, it's certainly the case that today versus a year versus 2 years ago versus 3 years ago, that those hurdles are higher, and we're only really moving in one direction. But I think buyers and sellers too are getting used to those hurdles, but every so often, like with Prue, there is another side curveball that's thrown at a deal, and the deals have managed to jump the hurdles to date, and I'm sure they will find ways around the next set of hurdles from the regulation perspective. Yeah, I think it is getting hard.
I think to take positive, it's very important to have a reliable regulatory framework for our business in general. Now we have in the US, UK, Europe, different framework for doing our legal transfers. Having gone through a lot of regulatory processes in the last 10 years, and also currently going through two approval processes, I think, which is very sad, the regulators got a little bit more careful, and there's a scrutiny on governance topics, and every acquirer has to show commitment and has to show not only a status quo, but also a forward-looking perspective of the business, and what is the intention, how the transaction should be executed, and after completion should be run off. So I think that puts also a little bit more pressure on potential new entrants of what we just had before.
And if I may add just a couple of things, I'm very supportive of regulators being active and present in this market. Again, I think it's good for the reputation of the market to show that this is a business that's done in a professional manner. And I also think that the good reputation, or the improving reputation of run-off buyers that we've been observing in the last 10 years also applies to regulators, in the sense that they also see that buyers are more and more professional, are behaving in a way that is fully in line with the sellers in terms of how they manage the liabilities, and I think this is very reassuring for regulators, and that gives them a lot of comfort. Now, obviously, this doesn't apply to new entrants, as you've just said, and I agree with that. So I think it's something that
players who have been around for a long time can benefit from.
Okay, thank you. Very conscious of time, so the last question, I'll just have 30 seconds per panelist of what they envisage seeing in the next 12 months to do with the industry. I don't want Brexit covered because that's not a 30-second subject, or Trump or any other.
Not the next 12 months.
So, Paul, next 12 months?
Yeah, I think we're going to see a number of transactions. I think the traditional insurance, reinsurance carriers, but possibly even more transactions from non-insurance companies that have insurance liabilities on their balance sheet, captives, potentially also some government entities as well, where we can potentially provide some solutions. So I think we'll see a widening of the market and some more sort of non-traditional sellers.
I think what I'd really like to see is a lot more collaboration across the market. I think IRLA can be a big driver there, and here's AirOp too. I think sell side, buy side coming together to raise awareness of all the good stuff that the market does, to try and get that message as broadly into the live part of the sector as possible, to try and ultimately feed the narrative that is this market is a part of a much broader market and a much a natural end to the underwriting cycle, and hopefully we'll make some good strides there over the course of next year, but we do all need to come together on that.
And we're delighted to work with our members in that regard. So members of IRLA, AirOp, then if you have burning ambitions to see something driven forward, then do step up, and we're all busy people, but we can find the time to attend to matters that need that attention. Sorry, James.
So yeah, I mean, we're just seeing reserve risk kind of going up the agenda on forward decision making and thinking. So I think we will see an increase in opportunities around reserve risk for earnings stability reasons and for capital management, and it won't all be kind of Part 7 transfer type structures or legal transfer type structures. We're going to see a lot more loss portfolio transfers and even adverse development coverage. We're going to be focusing, Lloyd's is probably going to be a big focus for us, and continental Europe as well, where we try and keep the drum a bit more this year.
And for us.
And for you.
I make it very short. So Lloyd's prepared, we had this topic already at the beginning of this roundtable. Lloyd's prepared a good plan. It will come down to the execution, so I think we will see there more activity, because legacy is playing, I truly believe, an important role in supporting the transformation in the Lloyd's market, and also coming from a strong M&A cycle. The same there. During M&A, there are a lot of nice assumptions and plans to make an acquisition happen. When it comes down to the execution and the implementation of those plans, legacy is on the agenda to streamline balance sheets and make the transition work.
And finally, I expect to see from sellers, a continuous flow of deals, and particularly coming from recent underwriting years, because this is really something that we've been observing recently more than in the past, and from buyers, more discipline.
Thank you. And for me, in the next 12 months, I'll see if I can get the new chairman to pack some sun cream and a hat and get over here to do the presentation next year. But on that note,